Welcome to another episode of Housing Matters, the Rental Housing Association of Washington's podcast. Thank you to all of our listeners and those who have suggested topics or sent me emails. I value all of your input. Before we get to this week's interview, I want to give a profound thank you to everyone who came out to our first RHA PAC fundraiser of the year at the Tacoma Country and Golf Club. We had a great turnout of members as well as elected officials and candidates to rally for the rights of housing providers. My interview this week is with economist Morgan Shook from ECOnorthwest. Morgan has done quite a bit of study in the rental housing sphere and testified on various rental housing bills during this year's legislative session. We discussed rent control, tenant assistance dollars, and supply-side issues for rental housing. Well, Morgan Shook with ECOnorthwest, thank you so much for joining the Rental Housing Association of Washington's podcast, Housing Matters.
All right. Corey, thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. I usually like to start the podcast kind of by asking you about yourself, where you're from, where you grew up, and how you found your way to ECOnorthwest.
All right, I'll try to keep that short. Like everybody's backstory, it can get a little long-winded.
Sure.
But I was born in Vietnam. My dad was an American serviceman. Met my mom. We lived there for many years before having to move back at the due to the war. But then landed in Tacoma, which was where my dad grew up. And like I think everybody says, who's from there, you can take the kid out of the 253, but you can't take the 253 out of the kid. So Tacoma, was basically the formative years of my life, and so go Henry Foss Falcons.
Yes. I'm a Stadium grad. I know we talked about this offline, but I'm a Stadium grad. So both Tacoma natives. So you spent some time down there at UPS. How was that?
So actually, I was a kind of molecular biologist by undergrad training, and then I worked in biotech in Seattle for a number of years, the Institute of Systems Biology, and so it was a, full-on like lab scientist doing a lot of work, all the heavy lifting on a lot of the big projects that they were doing at the time. After kind of probably talking to too many disgruntled postdocs, I thought about changing careers a little bit, and so actually had a great opportunity to go work at the University of Chicago, and I landed in the Department of Health Disparities, working on a number of different projects, but probably the most formative one was looking at treatments for folks with cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But most of that work took me into throughout the Midwest to some of the, I guess, poorest urban and rural areas. And that was just a very formative experience of understanding kind of place and opportunity and disadvantage, and changed my sort of career, and decided to kind of reorient myself into kind of urban public policy. And so went back to grad school to kind of reposition, but always kind of approached my work as a researcher first, and knowing sort of how difficult and challenging it is to do a lot of this, and particularly to communicate kind of what we know from theory and evidence to inform just better decision making. And so my time here at ECOnorthwest has really been centered, I think, I always describe it as people taking an active position on the land. So a lot of that has to do with sort of land development from a sort of investment perspective, a policy or taxation perspective. And so a lot of that work extends to working with a range of different clients, both on the public side, nonprofit side, and on the private side, people trying to do and develop housing. So I have a pretty broad experience working in all facets in that ecosystem. Wow. Yeah. Okay. I didn't know all that about it. So you bring quite a bit to the table when you came here. Okay. Outside of work, what are some of your kind of hobbies and activities and things that you like to do when you're not crunching numbers and doing all that? My wife and I, we kind of probably got started on having kids a little later than maybe we should have, just because having kids is a young person's endeavor. But that said, I have 2 young girls, and they basically occupy all my free time outside of work. But
that's the exact same answer I give to people. Yes. What hobbies do you speak of? Yeah. I have a 6'4" and a 2-year-old. So yeah, I would say my hobby is
mine are 14 and 12.
Keeping them from
Exactly. Yeah, you haven't gotten, maybe you're not quite to the point where you're like fully into sort of parent Uber service, but it's
not quite. But we're starting that with the sports and everything. Yeah. Speaking of your time in Tacoma, can you briefly discuss the study you were a part of with regards to the light rail extension that they're working on from Federal Way to Tacoma?
Yeah. So a lot of my practice, I think, something is called sort of equitable development, and the work there is really working with Sound Transit to understand the impacts of building light rail. And they think of that kind of in sort of 2 respects. So the first respect is really well, we got to like buy a bunch of land, disrupt the land use, build the facility. But once we do that, we kind of create a new sort of like a, template, right, for development to take place, to take advantage of the fact that people are going to value being close to transit stations. And so part of that is twofold. Like, well, what are we disrupting, and are there things that decision makers need to understand around disrupting the local commercial or housing economic development ecosystem that's there? And the second piece is, when Sound Transit comes and acquires land, particularly around stations, that build the stations, what are the opportunities to do sort of more equitable development? And a lot of that means sort of mixing questions around the affordability of housing, as well as the affordability of commercial space, to sort of help communities kind of meet that their goals and provide sort of some sense of more shared prosperity and leverage for those investments.
Sure. Now to jump down to housing, won't quite get to rent control yet, but you've done quite a few studies with regards to housing planning and development, Sumner, Bonnie Lake, Pierce County impact fee assessment, as well as some MFT stuff in Bellevue. Can you speak to some of that?
Yeah. So I didn't get involved in this career to kind of do housing stuff. It was actually some work back in the late aughts when I was on the Seattle Planning Commission. I was co-chair of the Land Use and Housing Committee. And we were just mostly thinking about housing. And I think at that time, right, we had the big run up in towards the Great Recession and the housing bubble, however you want to think about whether that's a bubble or not. But all to say is probably the first exposure to kind of my understanding of sort of housing cost burden and some of the sort of just compounding and isolated effects that people have, particularly in kind of low income households and particularly in renters. And so I just basically dove in and said, well, what does the research kind of say? And I think at that first piece, it was pretty clear, like, oh, we just don't have enough housing. And that's kind of the simple answer. But I don't think it was one that I think people really spent a whole lot of time digesting and really sort of thinking through. And because part of it was, from that early time, it became really clear that, like, wow, we just haven't built enough housing that provides enough sort of what I think people call naturally occurring affordability. But basically, the fact that housing typically filters, except when you have extreme scarcities where this filtering goes the other way. And things that should be a lot more affordable, but given their age and quality, are a lot more expensive. And so that was probably the first thing in terms of my exposure. I would say the following decade was working with a range of stakeholders, both on the public and private side, just to raise the issue around housing scarcity. And those ideas started to get a lot more traction, particularly in the last 5 to 6 years, because of the affordability crisis. Particularly in, coming out of that Great Recession, we saw so much investment really sort of centered in a lot of just housing constrained places, typically on the coasts. And so I would say what's been different in the last 5 years? I would say the state and local governments have gotten much more serious around housing and housing affordability. And we've seen policies to sort of, are sort of, I would say, decentralized, but like mandated central kind of planning apparatus through the Growth Management Act and comprehensive planning to sort of embed principles of trying to get more housing built and particularly deliver that in ways that we haven't. I would say the first phase of GMA and particularly trying to intensify housing in sort of urban centers really was kind of a one-size-fits-all, right? Basically, we're going to build a bunch of housing and it's all going to come in really dense form. And you see it in the data, right? We used to build stuff, a diversity of kind of housing types, and then the last 10 years, we were only building one kind of thing.
Studios, one bedrooms,
200 unit sort of dense product, because the economically and both from a regulatory perspective, it's the only thing you could build. And people kind of say, like, make housing legal. Well, that was the only legal thing you could do. And so I would say this next phase, I think we'll be curious to watch how much cities can implement opportunities to build different kinds of housing to meet different kinds of needs for households. And that's going to have a huge price impact, not just because like we're adding a whole lot of supply given where demand is, but we're adding different kinds of supply that will be attractive to different kinds of folks. So that said, I think that's kind of a big picture perspective on sort of the big regulatory piece. Underneath that, right, there's a lot of different things around, what are we doing with inclusionary zoning? What are we doing with our tax incentives like MFTE? And that's just, I think, hopefully, I think jurisdictions are getting more serious about trying to find ways to make those things work a little better, because I think in a lot of ways, what's on the books in many places really isn't sort of tailored to sort of the optimize for the policy objective they have today.
Okay. Rent control.
Yeah.
From an economic perspective, they had kind of the first generation, during the Depression and after World War II and all that. Can you describe kind of the difference between that form versus kind of what we're seeing in modern day?
Yeah, no, I think people use lots of different terms here. And from rent control to sort of rent stabilization, but they all fundamentally are talking about the same set of kind of call them sort of policy parameters,
sure,
actions that one can take. And so when we talk about sort of first generation, or sometimes people say very strict, they are very blunt tools. This current generation is seeking to sort of modify things that will change sort of the nature of the impact. And let me explain kind of what I think are the three big pieces. So when we talk about older generation, are very strict. So there are three things, I'll talk about them here. The first is actually, what is the price control? Like, what are the caps with respect to how much rent can be raised, when, is it targeted, is there a board, whatever. So the level isn't really important. The next two pieces are really about extent. And the first one is about what people call vacancy decontrol is the formal term for it. But basically is, can you reset the rent after a tenant moves out or not? Right. And then the third piece is really about what does this apply to? And typically on one side, you can say, well, it applies to every unit, the existing one and new. And some other one provisions have basically clauses that say it doesn't apply to sort of new construction.
Sure.
And so with that in mind, when we think about older or stricter forms, they typically had much more stringent price controls. So it's at much lower CPI or even lower. They had there was no vacancy decontrol. So basically the unit was locked into sort of these price controls for the life of the structure. And there were no clauses for it to not to sort of impact new construction. What you've seen now, I think, in the last few years is for people to recognize, like, those are very big things that control the marketplace, and they were delivering, for the best of people can understand, some unintended consequences in the sense that people weren't sort of building new things, or they weren't really meeting some of the policy and social goals of trying to cap that price. And so the newer policies are trying to say, well, one, what is the sort of cap, right? Maybe we'll set it at a little higher, at 5, 6, 7, 10, right?
Sure.
And so the question is sort of, what is that price? The next piece is really about vacancy decontrol. Like, if somebody moves out, we'll let you reset their rent then. And the third piece is like, well, maybe we'll let you sort of exempt new construction and have it not apply to it. Sure. So I think that's a very simple sort of framework for understanding kind of how rent control started and where it has been going in some of these current sort of permutations for policy proposals. Sure.
So it's almost like they think rent control will disincentivize new construction. You could almost say that.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of part of here, and I think it's really important to sort of also acknowledge here is there's a lot of conjecture about the impacts. There's a lot about what theory can tell us, because it's like, well, if you're stuck with costs that you have no control of, and then you also have a price environment that you have no control on. There's a lot of body of evidence that these price controls don't really lead to sort of really efficient outcomes. And then you think about it from a rent control perspective, there isn't actually a whole lot of great high quality evidence that helps us understand kind of really what the observed impacts are. And part of that is because, and if you look at any jurisdiction, there's lots. They've arranged their price stabilization or rent control or rent stabilization laws in ways that are really hard to sort of disentangle kind of where we would expect the impact to be and what the extent of that has been.
You think in places like New York City,
San Francisco, right? Or even more internationally, like in Sweden and Stockholm, right? Very kind of different kinds of systems, and that have led to kind of different kinds of impacts. But I think generally the theory around this and the empirical sort of findings are fairly consistent. But I think, again, there's still a lot of conjecture on both sides. And so everyone should be wary when consuming analysis here.
I don't know if you're familiar with the study done from Cambridge, Massachusetts, when they lifted rent control there, but they had like a 20% increase in building permits. And I think over the first decade, it was something like $2 billion in realized property value.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess that's one of the bigger studies I've seen, but
yeah, I would say probably the two best sort of studies in this are that Cambridge study, and that findings are consistent with kind of what you describe it. And the other great one is the work that Professor Diamond has been doing at Stanford. Just in terms of like we'll call high quality research projects, where like the hypothesis is clear, the data analytics are very strong, and the findings are fairly robust.
Sure.
Right. And so and both of those tell, I would say, consistent, but also very interesting stories around, some of the sort of impacts of rent control. So.
And Professor Diamond kind of gears more towards, I did a lot of San Francisco research, right? And kind of the expansion of their rent control instead of getting rid of it in the mid 90s, and kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but I think kind of the findings from that were people would renovate their units for kind of high income earners, and even the things that were built were catered more towards high income earners. And so it was kind of did this lead to gentrification in San Francisco?
Yeah, so her research was basically taking advantage of a little bit of a natural experiment. With changing the policy and the ability to sort of harness some administrative data so that they could figure out like, well, who was in these units and how do they change? And so on one side, right, I think along what you just said, on one side, right, in a very short-term perspective, like that price control was very beneficial to a lot of folks, and particularly folks who are very disadvantaged and at the fringes of sort of the housing market, right? You capped their rent, they were able to kind of stay in those places. But then as you looked over time, right, those folks left and were replaced with other folks who maybe not necessarily at the same level of disadvantage who were occupying a lot of those units. That's simply, I think about it as sort of the benefit side of it.
Sure.
On the cost side, what happened is along what you articulated, the changing those rules changed the market dynamics with respect to sort of call it the production frontier between renting and owning, to the extent that a lot of what we would expect those units to stay in the rental market disappeared. Most of that was through sort of what you said, conversions to sort of non-rental housing.
Sure.
But also some of it could show up in the sense that you're just not building the things that you would expect to be building because of those price caps.
Okay, yeah. You did some research for the Partnership for Affordable Housing, which RHA is a member of that organization. And it was really just on rent control as a whole. And I know we've already talked about it a little bit, but could you, I guess, kind of summarize your findings on that?
Yeah. So when the partnership approached me and said, "Hey, can you help just put together something to help policymakers understand what rent control is and just sort of demystify it a little bit?"
Sure.
Because there's a lot. It's obviously a very sort of inflammatory sort of politics around it.
Sure.
Could we provide some understanding of what's happening? Where is there quality research? And thinking then about sort of the unintended consequences of such policies in Washington. And so we're not testing any specific policy because there was no policy, but it's really trying to understand. And here is where Professor Diamond's research is instructive, because we can simply say in a very simple counterfactual, something like this: what would be the scale of the impact in Washington with respect to housing and housing affordability, as well as sort of the collateral economic and tax impacts? Because investment in Washington housing is a really key part of our tax base, given our sort of, I would call them, unique property tax laws and the fact that sales tax is collected on construction activities. So the point of this being here is to say, what do we know about the underlying problem with respect, and I think for policymakers to really understand, like a lot of this is because we're not producing enough housing. That is the central piece. The challenge with that not producing is that we've then put disproportionately the impacts of that scarcity on renter households, particularly households who are lower income. They have felt the brunt of housing cost burdening, not just in Washington, but everywhere in the country where it has a scarcity issue. How does rent control then sit on top of that, given the best information that we have? And in sort of more sort of older or strict forms of that, we would expect to have what we'd seen in other places, sort of, unintended long-term consequences with respect to the housing problem.
Sure.
So the underlying problem you've actually made worse. And so we want to step back and say, well, given that, what is really the policy prescription here that is going to help both in the short run and long run for renters who are very much sort of in economic distress because of, I would say, kind of a lot of ways, policy made errors with respect to making the housing regulations and marketplace way too tight and not letting it flex to expand to meet demand and not letting it flex fast enough, right, to meet demand.
Okay. That kind of leads into my next question, actually. Seattle's rental housing policies, I guess mostly instituted in the last 4 or 5 years or so. Extended notice periods, relocation assistance, obviously eviction moratorium, still withstanding for winter evictions, but just during the COVID era as well. And it's been a factor, we think, behind the loss of almost 7,000 single-family units, according to the Seattle City Auditor's report, which was actually requested by then Councilwoman Shama Sawant, and I don't think it showed the results she was hoping for. But I guess what are your kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that was a very interesting analysis. So I think they were able to do a couple different things, and a lot of it was because of the rental registry ordinance that were put in effect, where all rental properties have to sort of register with the city of Seattle. There are obviously changes in rental protections that happen coincident and really near term of that. But I would say the opportunity here was very interesting because the challenge with doing research in this space is the quality of information, right?
Sure.
Can you identify who these folks are? Are they renters? When are they in it? And so here you have actually a very great data set to sort of take a look at this. Yeah. And so what you alluded to there was kind of twofold, right? So the auditor said, like, we have a lot more rental housing than we did, in 2022 than we did in 2016. Not surprised, right? We built a lot of rental housing at that time. And I think the other part of it, back to my earlier point, the only thing we were building is really large structures, right? So all that growth is really being taken up by growth in large apartment buildings. But the other part of that here is we actually have less rental parcels with housing. So where did that loss come from? It was almost exclusively made up by single family rentals or smaller rentals that then exited the rental market. And so the audit is basically trying to say, why did this happen? And they have kind of two pieces of that, right? So the first piece is just to say, well, what happened to those properties? And for the most part, a lot of those properties were demolished. Another single family property built on it, a rental property built on it, or they simply exited the rental pool. And so that's where it gets very interesting. And then the second part, right, there's a survey analysis that says, well, why did you guys leave? And here, I think, I would call this far from settled, but like there's a lot of evidence here when people were self-reporting as actual sort of small providers of rental housing that suggests that the complexity and burden of complying with these rules have been the main source of that. And so all things being equal, right, you could say like, well, if this is a rental property, whatever, you can have to comply. But people have choices, and here, right, the choice is really about, do I keep it in the rental pool or do I do something else with it? Right. And so in a lot of those cases, the choice was to sell, to that was converted to from a renter occupancy to a single family occupancy. And so you actually have a net loss of housing in this space for rentals. And so the policy question here is not just broader. So I think of it in two respects. On one side, right, you have basically, well, here's a kind of housing that's not available anymore to be rented, both in terms of structure, but also in terms of price, location, right, across, because our rental market is not uniform even within a big city, right? We have these urban places, but then we still have neighborhoods where a lot of this housing was there. And then the other part is really I'd call it on the flip side of that, a provider perspective, right? And I think this is something that the audit report also had some understanding, is that you have a whole lot of different kinds of of actors in this space, right? You have people who just own homes, and they're coming from immigrant or BIPOC communities, and this is a form of sort of business and wealth generation. And then obviously you have other folks who are just like, these are investment properties, and I'm running
kids' college fund or
exactly,
yeah.
Right. And so I think part of it, this is very interesting in the sense of like, well, what is the effect here of losing a lot of these folks, and what's the role of policy? And so my takeaway here is that at the margins, it sure feels like a lot of these rules have made it more difficult for these providers to rent, and have also been a source of sort of, we call it sort of interesting sort of conflict. I think the report noted that from a kind of housing and or sort of rental dispute, single family homes made up the vast majority of complaints filed to the city. And so all to say is, it sure feels like there's a lot of smoke relative to the fire that was sort of brewing on that side.
Sure. Thank you. That's very detailed. Yeah, I was looking at you alluded to the those who purchased a rental property outside of Seattle, and it was 41% of respondents. And the pool that they surveyed wasn't huge, but I thought that was very telling of, no, I don't want to get out of providing rental housing. I just don't want to do it here. And so I thought that was very telling. And as you said, a lot of them just said it was difficult to comply with the new rules and regulations. In your report that you did for Partnership Affordable Housing, you mentioned a possible solution being rental assistance. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I remember someone telling me this, I think somewhat sort of jokingly, but he was making the point. He's like, the problem with sort of housing affordability isn't sort of housing prices. It's the fact that people don't have enough money. Yeah. And so, tongue in cheek, but the wisdom of that is to really understand sort of how one might be able to sort of address the concentration of the impact of housing affordability amongst lower income households. Sure. And this is also kind of a drawback with rent control, right? It's a really coarse tool. And if you were to add up all the benefits of actually capping people's rent, the vast majority of those benefits are all going to flow to sort of fairly high income households.
Sure.
And so in the policy speak, we call this a targeting issue, right? Or means testing, like the means of which to help somebody out. Like there is a great public case to be saying, hey, these people are actually in distress and policy needs to be directed at them.
Sure.
And so in this case, things like vouchers, short-term rental assistance, and my pet project is actually also sort of tax subsidies, are ways of directing money towards that problem, and particularly for those populations that have been most in sort of need of that assistance. So let's just talk about each one of those things separately. So the first one is like vouchers, right? Everybody's heard of Section 8 vouchers, and I think probably most people listening here were like, oh, we got a bad rap. But I would say if you look at it carefully, the use of the vouchers for households that are using them is extremely beneficial. Those, with regard to sort of both housing stability and just the sort of, call it the emotional and social sort of shadow benefits that flow from just being stably housed, right? But administratively, it hasn't worked very well. And so the question for vouchers is really about, can we find a feasible, administratively simple solution to kind of get this ramped up, because the benefits are there and the challenges are really mostly in the administrative side, not in the sense that they don't work.
We hear that from the fair housing people that we talk with, is exactly, it's the administration of it.
Yeah. So here, I think, then comes in short-term rental assistance. And short-term rental assistance, I think, for the longest period of time, right, it's always been kind of this little program that's moved here and there, run through lots of different kinds of smaller community-driven organizations to sort of provide sort of like, oh, you know what, I had an unexpected cost, or I lost my job. Like, can we find a way to bridge your sort of housing costs for a period of time? We had this thing called COVID, and the government responded with large subsidies that governments eventually got to pushing out into households to help people stay in their housing. And there's a sort of a year ago, the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University did a sort of preliminary analysis of this, and lo and behold, as you would expect, people who were eligible and were able to get short-term rental housing helped them stay in their homes. It helped their not just sort of the economic situation, but it helped their psychosocial sort of just the stability of sort of just being in the place. So all to say here is like this seems like a very check the box, right? Means tested, provides housing stability, and probably a really great bang for your buck. The other big piece too that comes into here is really tax subsidies. And this is kind of a little different piece than short-term rental assistance or vouchers, but Washington has the multifamily property tax exemption. Started with a 10-year program just to help stimulate infill. Was split into two separate programs, a 12-year program that has a 20% set aside for affordable housing. And then there's also an 8-year program that cities have pretty wide discretion. Most cities, right, are gravitating towards the 12-year program. But there have been various pushes also to offer a affordable, just a straight affordable exemption. And you think about places that have done this. New York City is probably the one that comes to mind. It is their largest housing affordability program. And Washington is a little more unique because it's not a way of necessarily giving up property tax revenue for local jurisdictions, but just redistributes that burden across all property tax payers. And you can, and when we say, well, you're increasing my burden, but you know what? Housing affordability isn't the problem of a specific cohort like housing providers or some industry, right? This is a broadly shared responsibility, and things like the property tax are very equitable, fair, and progressive ways to share that burden to underwrite these challenges of keeping people housed.
It's interesting you brought up the Harvard study. I actually took a glance through that, I don't know, maybe a month and a half ago or so. And I gleaned some of the same information as you from that, but I also found it telling towards the end. They kind of summarized that, especially these small rental housing providers, they're not raising prices to like gouge people. They're raising prices because their cost of doing business and maintenance and all that has gone up so substantially along with everything else, inflation and all the rest. So I found that very telling coming from Harvard. I'm like, well, okay, these guys understand. This is what they're showing. I want to just briefly touch on I barely want to call it a study, but a study from the sociology department at University of Washington that kind of pushes back on the claim that the small mom and pop housing providers are leaving the market. And the data sets they used, I mean, they didn't use any of the city's data from the audit report that we were discussing earlier. And they referenced Professor Diamond a little bit, but they seem to be very selective with the information that they took from the studies. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I've had a chance to take a look at that. And obviously, it made the rounds during the last session. I have a couple of thoughts. So first of all, it's a preprint, and so when people do research and they want to get the results out there, or they want to get feedback on what they're doing, they'll make it available on a number of different academic sort of preprint sites.
Sure.
So particularly in sort of pursuit of sort of publishing it somewhere. In reviewing the study, I would say, I'll give it the sort of most sort of reading of sort of good intent, right?
Yeah.
Like they wanted to test this question. The question was basically, the hypothesis they have is basically, hey, the city of Seattle put forward these sort of a series of sort of rental regulations that and from 2016 to 2018. And if this truly had an impact on smaller providers, we would see these folks exit the marketplace. Okay, and so the way they did the study was to say, hey, we're going to try to match up this third-party data set that should identify who renters are and put them in rental properties, and then we can use the assessor's information to kind of say, okay, we're going to find small properties.
Sure.
And so my thoughts on this are, I would say overall from a research design, it's very interesting. I think the economic sort of doing what they call a difference in difference. So they basically said, well, let's look at the change in renter occupied housing in Seattle relative to everywhere else in neighboring sort of communities and see if it's different. And so their conclusion was to say, look, we did this matchings process and we didn't see any difference in the rate of sales for these small renter places pre and post the city's actions. And so therefore, there's no impact of these regulations on mom and pop. So I guess my sort of thinking here is there's a couple things I'd want to better understand that the study didn't sort of articulate. The first one, I think, is just mostly at this hypothesis and sort of conclusion piece. So basically, they said there's no change in sale prices, therefore there's no impact of these policies on mom and pop, which I think is a bit of a strong reach, right?
Yeah.
Because I would even suggest, like, looking at what the city put forward, I wouldn't necessarily say my main metric would be whether or not people exited the marketplace and chose to sell.
Yeah.
It would be, well, what happens to these rental properties, with respect to who they're renting it to? And so given the data they had, that actually is something they could actually look at. So, once they had these properties and these are renters, did we find that they switched between renting and occupying? So, I mean, that would be actually been the test that they should have looked at for these properties to sort of determine whether or not there's actually an impact on these folks. That said, most of the other part is like having worked with, haven't worked with this sort of particular data, but a lot of third-party data, that is a wickedly hard problem to do, to basically use this information to identify who we think a renter is.
Sure.
And place them on sort of what we think are rental properties. And so there, I would say my big, not that they couldn't have done it, but what I would have liked to have seen is a bunch of robustness checks to say, like, did we actually able to do that?
Yeah.
Or are we just simply saying, like, this is just here's a method we can put forward and we're going to call it renters moving, but without actually sort of validating the fact that we actually identify the renters. So all to say is I would, this is what kind of goes back to my first point is, like, there isn't a whole lot of great high quality evidence. And so when people are consuming these studies, be very careful to kind of say, like, well, is this great evidence? Is this really no evidence? And so this study, I would say, I would just say, like, kind of pause and say, I would be agnostic. I'm not sure it says anything yet.
Sure. It's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. And so I would consume information like that with that respect.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That was a nice analysis on that. I appreciate that. Well, Morgan Shook from ECOnorthwest, thank you so much for joining Housing Matters, the Rental Housing Association of Washington's podcast. I very much appreciate your very detailed insight and your time. I think our listeners will find it very insightful and valuable.
Yep. Happy to do it. Thank you, Corey.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of Housing Matters. Be sure to subscribe so you can receive alerts when we post new episodes. You can find Housing Matters wherever you get your podcasts. If you prefer the video version, don't worry, that will always be available at the RHA YouTube channel. If you have a topic you believe should be covered in a future episode of Housing Matters, reach out to me by email at chjalseth@rhawa.org. The views expressed in episodes of RHAWA's Housing Matters podcast do not necessarily represent the views and policies of the Rental Housing Association of Washington. Formal legal advice and review is recommended prior to selection and use of this information. RHAWA does not represent your selection or execution of this information as appropriate for your specific circumstance. The material contained and represented herein, although obtained from reliable sources, is not considered legal advice or to be used as a substitution for legal counsel. Copyright 2024.